Wow. As I look around this room, I recognize a few people, but really very, very few. And it's just amazing how many people, how many circles Jeremy touched, and how many different ways he did so many wonderful things. So I guess it's not a surprise. Each of us saw a different facet, a different side of Jeremy's life. And I think, though, that there's one theme that in Jeremy's life resonated over and over and over again. He was always striving to be a man, to always do the right thing. And this was completely obvious to me that that would be the theme I was talking about. But as I started these notes, I was thinking about what does it mean to always do the right thing? And I realized there are a few different ways. Most of us do call it the easy path. We'll do the okay thing, the right thing, as long as it's not too hard to do. We're not doing anything wrong, we're doing right when we can. That's about it. There are a few people who I feel truly sorry for who are masochistic. They believe they have to suffer. The right thing is suffering. And that's not so good. Jeremy, though, managed to find a third path. He would always do the right thing, even when it made him uncomfortable. But his focus was not on being uncomfortable. It was not on suffering for the sake of suffering. His focus was always on doing the right thing, on tikkun olam, on making things better. And he always mixed a strong sense of the right thing with having fun, with enjoying it, with really seeing life and enjoying every facet of it. And I can't even begin to summarize all the things. As Lisa was speaking, I was thinking, oh my God, there's so many parts of Jeremy's life that I didn't really know. And as Nocturne was giving the overview, there's so many parts of life I don't really know. And I just knew one piece of Jeremy's life, how it impacted on me. So I'd like to go back to those MIT years and just sort of show how my life was shaped by Jeremy's and the impact he had on one person. I first met Jeremy in 1979. I was still in high school, and I had applied to MIT for college. I went up to Boston to visit the school, and I took Amtrak up, got off on South Station. So Bob knows the story well, he probably did it a few years ahead of me. And
Kendall Square.
Right, South Station took the train to Kendall Square and walked across campus. And I didn't know where I was going, what I was doing. Well, Jeremy met me, he hosted me, he fed me. I'll bet he answered 1,000 questions, probably each one more naive than the next. And his hospitality convinced me that MIT offered both the academic environment that I craved, along with the frum lifestyle that I really needed. I'd say Jeremy, more than anybody else, convinced me MIT was the place for me to spend the next few years. I then spent a year in Israel, and I started MIT the next fall. Jeremy and I became very close friends, and together we helped to run B'nai Akiva and to run the Zionist organization on campus. And basically just had so many stories of being American students, pretending we knew what it was to be going to Israel a few years, and trying to solve all the world's problems one step at a time. I don't know how many we solved, but it was so fun. The summer after he graduated, Jeremy remained on campus, and there was very little structure for Jewish life during the summer, so Jeremy took it upon himself to organize these giant Shabbos meals. And Heidi and I still fondly remember we once made this giant fruit salad. It was so big, there was no bowl to put it in. We had to find this giant industrial-sized garbage bag because there was nothing else to put it in. I don't know how Jeremy managed to buy all the fruit. I don't know how he got it back from the supermarket. He certainly didn't have a car at Central Square. Wasn't so close to Burton. But somehow he got all this fruit back, and I think we finished all the fruit. It may still be lying in a corner somewhere in the Burton suite. I don't know. Anyway, after that summer, Jeremy made Aliyah, and he started grad school at Hebrew U. He still remained very dedicated to the MIT Jewish community, and he was working nonstop to find jobs and co-op opportunities for all the students that he knew would follow him to Israel. I guess it's important to remind some of the younger people here that this was the early 80s. We had no cell phones, no Skype, very little email, and certainly no cheap international calls. If I remember right, phone calls then were about $2 a minute or so,
yes,
something like that. And despite that, Jeremy used to call every now and then, and he would constantly have his latest idea and his latest breakthrough. And given the time zone difference, he'd usually call me in the middle of the night Boston time. And the next morning, I would often speak with Heidi, and our conversations would usually go, Jeremy called last night. Oh, what's he up to? I don't remember. I was half asleep for most of the call. But despite these phone calls, somehow We made things happen and got some students to Israel. In the summer of '82, I spent a summer working at Hebrew University. When I arrived at Ben Gurion, two sights greeted me those first few minutes. Number one was military airplanes lined up. This was, I think, July 5th or July 6th. While I was flying, Shalom HaGalil had started. By the time I landed, there was a full-fledged war going on with military planes. The second thing I saw was Jeremy waiting for me. Don't worry, you're staying with me. And I went back to his dorm where I spent the next 8 weeks having a great time. A year later, Heidi, now my wife, at the time just a fellow student, spent a term at the Technion. So she flew to Israel, again knowing next to nobody here, and no big surprise, Jeremy met her at the airport, got her up to Haifa, though he was living in Jerusalem at the time. And again, he had no car. I'm sure he was studying for whatever grad students do, and somehow he managed to make it all work. Let's skip ahead a couple of years. 1985, I was working for a company in Boston, Symbolics. Aliyah was still in my mind, but a little bit less so. I was enjoying Boston life. Then Symbolics sold a couple of computers to the Machon Weizmann, and I managed to finagle the company to fly me to Israel to turn the machines on. It was a great job. At the time, Jeremy was already at the Machon Weizmann with his roommate Umberto. And of course, I stayed with him. I remember discovering a couple of things like the little red switch on the wall that turned on the hot water. I didn't know about such things then. And I met a bunch of friends who became close friends still till today. I remember very little of the work I actually did for Symbolics. It must have been a success, because I know they still had machines at the Machon Weizmann for a few years afterwards. But my strongest memory is my renewed commitment to Aliyah that Jeremy once again instilled in me. To make a long story short, I made Aliyah a couple of months later on in 1985. And my plans were all set. Jeremy had just bought his apartment in Piskat Ze'ev, and I was going to stay with him.
No electricity.
Oh, I wish it was that easy. The apartment wasn't finished yet. Jeremy was still staying with a friend of his, Bob Lang, who I had never met before. And so I landed the plane. By this point, Jeremy had a car. He was already a little more structured in life. So he said, David, I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is we don't have an apartment. The good news is don't worry about it. You have a place to stay.
We have a car.
Yep. So I spent the next week staying with the Langs and with Jeremy, and it worked out somehow. A week later, I found an apartment, and then over the next few weeks and months, Jeremy taught me the ropes of living in Israel, how to buy furniture, get the best kitchen appliances, how to settle into Israel. Anyway, years passed. Heidi and I married at 87. Jeremy got sick for the first time. He married Lisa, raised Shachar Chaim. We had our 2 girls. And we went on in our parallel but separate lives. But every time we visited the Barkans, we'd meet a new set of young Olim, sometimes 5 or 10 or 15 people around your Shabbos table. And each time I'd watch them all being helped, being guided and steered by Jeremy and Lisa. The last time I saw Jeremy, he was in the hospital. And he was still making plans for the future. He was still joking. He was still laughing. Looking back, it feels like my life followed the natural path. I was always a nerd, always enjoyed high tech, was always Zionist. I just did the natural thing. But I realized in so many ways, in so many steps, I was nudged by Jeremy. My tech career, making Aliyah, even giving Heidi the final push that got her here. Anyway, Jeremy, thank you for everything. We'll all miss you. That's it.